Hey team, this is an entry from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. Uh, the title of the entry is U.S. Trotskyism, the Socialist Workers' Party during and immediately after World War II. The Socialist Workers' Party lost an appreciable part of its adult membership and most of its youth organization as a consequence of the Shachtmanite split in 1940. However, it remained the major Trotskyist organization in the United States and the only U.S. affiliate of the Fourth International in which it assumed new responsibilities as a consequence of the Nazi conquest of most of Europe. During World War II and immediately afterwards, the Socialist Workers' Party gained more influence than it had previously had in the labor movement and a considerable increase in membership. The Socialist Workers' Party experienced a kind of governmental persecution which it never had undergone before or was to experience again, and suffered another significant split. The Labor Party issue. After the formation of the Socialist Workers' Party and the American Trotskyists fundamentally changed their position with regard to the idea of a Labor Party in the United States. They made this change largely on the basis of Trotsky's urging. In March 1938, Cannon, Shachtman, Vincent Dunne, Rose Harsner spent several days in Mexico in extensive conversations with Trotsky on a variety of subjects. Although most of the discussions centered on the question of establishing the Fourth International and the program which the new international organization should adopt, they also dealt with a number of issues directly concerned with the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party. The Labor Party discussion took place on March 21st. Cannon, Shachtman, and Dunne sketched for Trotsky certain specific problems concerning the Labor Party idea which the Socialist Workers' Party was facing. In Minnesota, where the unions were strong backers of the state's Farmer Labor Party, FLP, the Stalinists were deeply enmeshed in the apparatus of the FLP and were using their influence in Minneapolis to try to undermine Trotskyist influence in the labor movement in Minneapolis. In New York, the recently formed American Labor Party had the backing of many of the state's labor unions, but it was supporting the administration of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia in New York City and the Roosevelt administration on a national level. Throughout the country, labor's nonpartisan league, LNPL, which had been organized by the CIO, for the 1936 election, was involving unions in political activity to a greater degree than had hitherto been customary. Cannon seemed to be relatively receptive to the idea of Trotskyist support for a labor party. Shachtman was more skeptical about the idea. Dunne was particularly anxious to get advice concerning how the Trotskyists should act in the Minnesota situation. Trotsky urged his American followers to change their traditional position, which had been one of opposition to the Labor Party idea. He advised them to urge the unions in which they had some influence to affiliate with Labor's nonpartisan league and to fight with the Labor's nonpartisan league for the idea of forming a Labor Party. However, Trotsky insisted that in supporting the Labor Party idea, they should approach the subject from a revolutionary perspective. They should not urge formation of a, quote, reformist, end quote, party. Rather, they should suggest a program for the proposed Labor Party which would be based on the, quote, transitional demands, end quote, which they all agreed would be the basis of the program for the new Fourth International. He particularly stressed the demands for workers' access to the books of firms for which they worked, quote, workers' control, end quote, of industry, and the establishment of workers' militia, which Cannon suggested ought to be called, quote, workers' defense groups, end quote, since, quote, workers' militia, end quote, sounded, quote, too strange, end quote, to the American workers. Finally, Trotsky suggested to his followers that they should stress the eventual establishment of a, quote, workers' and farmers', end quote, government, which, although they might not say so to the workers, would be the equivalent of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Upon returning home, the Socialist Workers' Party leaders pushed the change of policy on the Labor Party issue. They ran into some resistance, and no agreement was reached at a Central Committee plenum in April 1938. There was particularly vocal opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party's youth group. However, after the April plenum, the Labor Party issue was debated in branch meetings in the party's international bulletin and in the theoretical journal New International. After 3 months of discussion, the issue was submitted to the membership for a referendum vote, an unusual procedure in a Trotskyist organization. A resolution endorsing the idea of support for a labor party was adopted in October 1938. Socialist Workers' Party's, quote, disaffiliation, end quote, from the Fourth International. During the Second World War, the Socialist Workers' Party concentrated particularly on 5 kinds of activities. These were its association with the Fourth International, some limited electoral activity, work in the organized labor movement, participation in the civil rights struggle, and the campaign to defend its leaders who were indicted at the behest of the Department of Justice in mid-1941. Although the Socialist Workers' Party's activities in the Fourth International were dealt with elsewhere in this volume, here it is worthwhile to note the party's action in December 1940 to formally withdraw from the International. In October 1940, the U.S. Congress adopted the Voorhis Act, which provided for registration of, quote, any group affiliated to a foreign government or to an international political organization, end quote, and for such groups to turn over to the government list of its members and officials. In response, quote, rather than comply with these provisions which would subject the party's members and sympathizers to government harassment, a special convention of the Socialist Workers' Party in December 1940 voted to disaffiliate from the Fourth International, end quote. From then on, the Socialist Workers' Party maintained the legal fiction that it did not, quote, belong, end quote, to the Fourth International. Its delegates to the various congresses of the International always presumably had, quote, consultative, end quote, status, although they clearly played major roles in the proceedings, including votes on resolutions and other decisions. For its part, the U.S. government did not for some time give up its efforts to have the Socialist Workers' Party register under the Voorhis Act. In October 1946, N.T. Elif, chief of the Foreign Agents Registration Section, wrote the party about the matter. In reply, Cannon, in his capacity as National Secretary, wrote the party's Chicago lawyer, Michael J. Myers, saying that, quote, we would like you to reply to Mr. Elif if in our behalf that we have no relationship with the Fourth International or any other body that would require us to register with the Foreign Agents Registration Section, end quote. Cannon added that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party is an autonomous, independent organization and has no affiliation with parties or groups outside the United States. Our views are in many ways similar to the views of the Fourth International as expressed in the press of the Fourth International and its sections throughout the world, but this is only a matter of coincidence since we derive our views from a common socialist program, end quote. James P. Cannon. Socialist Workers' Party attitude towards World War II. During the Second World War, the activities and fate of the Socialist Workers' Party were largely determined by the party's attitude toward that conflict. In this regard, the Socialist Workers' Party followed policies consistent with their Marxist-Leninist Trotskyist philosophy, which they worked out with Trotsky in some detail in 1939-40. From the beginning, they were opposed to taking sides in the, quote, imperialist war, end quote. Typical of the Socialist Workers' Party position was the resolution on Proletarian Military Policy adopted in September 1940. It proclaimed, quote, "The imperialist war is not our war, and the militarism of the capitalist state is not our militarism. We do not support the war and militarism of the imperialist any more than we support the capitalist exploitation of workers in the factories. We are against the war as a whole, just as we are against the rule of the class which conducts the war, and never under any circumstances vote to give them any confidence in their conduct of the war or preparation for the war, not a man, not a cent, not a gun with our support," end quote. The Trotskyists recognized that many workers to whom they were appealing were impressed with the menace of Hitlerism and even favored military conscription. David Frankel has commented that, quote, "In keeping with its general approach to trying to reach the masses of workers, the Socialist Workers' Party opposed the strategy of individual resistance to the draft while defending the rights of those individuals who did refuse conscription," end quote. Beyond that, they developed their own particular, quote, "program for the draft." The resolution on Proletarian Military Policy proclaimed, quote, "The revolutionary strategy can only be to take this militarism as a reality and counterpose a class program of the proletariat to the program of the imperialist at every point. We fight against sending the worker soldiers into battles without proper training and equipment. We oppose the military direction of worker soldiers by bourgeois officers who have no regard for their treatment, their protection, and their lives. We demand federal funds for the military training of workers and worker officers under the control of the trade unions. Military appropriations, yes, but only for the establishment and equipment of worker training camps. Compulsory military training of the workers, yes, but only under the control of the trade unions," end quote. In spite of its general opposition to World War II and U.S. participation in World War II, the Socialist Workers' Party was true to its Trotskyist position when it came to participation of the USSR in the struggle. An article by George Brightman, writing as Albert Parker in the Militant in July 1941, stated, quote, "Class-conscious American Negroes must defend the Soviet Union against the Soviet Union's imperialist enemies as part of their own struggle. ... We do not pretend that the Soviet Union is an ideal country where all problems have been solved, where socialism has been reached, not at all, but it is a workers' state where power has been taken over out of the hands of the employers and the landlords, where capitalist bosses no longer run the factories for their own profit, where the foundations for a better life have been laid," end quote. Arguing that workers would rally to the defense of their union even if it were led by, quote, "reactionary bureaucrats," end quote, Brightman maintained that, quote, "In the same sense, advanced workers, Negro and white, must call for the defense of the Soviet Union. If the imperialist powers win, they will carve up the Soviet Union in the same way the bosses would break up a union," end quote. Socialist Workers' Party policies in the other areas, including electoral action and the trade union movement, were largely determined by their attitude toward the war. The 1940 election. In 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, by then strongly launched in his campaign to aid Great Britain to hold out against the Nazis, was a candidate for an unprecedented third term. This presented a problem for Socialist Workers' Party leaders. When Farrell Dobbs visited Trotsky in Mexico in January 1940, before proceeding to New York to assume the post of National Labor Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, he discussed the question of what the party should do. Trotsky urged that the party should name its own candidate against Roosevelt. At the same time, he proposed a labor ticket to oppose the president, to be headed by Daniel J. Tobin, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, from whose staff Dobbs had recently resigned. Dobbs reported back to the party leadership, but no decision on the election was taken. What the Socialist Workers' Party should do had not been decided by the time a delegation consisting of Cannon, Sam Gordon, Joseph Hansen, and Dobbs went to Mexico to discuss that and other issues with Trotsky in June 1940. Trotsky was critical of the Socialist Workers' Party not having launched its own campaign, whether with Tobin or someone from the party itself. Dobbs noted that, quote, lacking our own slate, Trotsky continued, we had to choose between Earl Browder, who headed the Communist Party's presidential ticket, and Norman Thomas, the Socialist Party's candidate for president, end quote. Dobbs added that, quote, Thomas was ruled out, though, because of his ties with Social Democrats standing at the left tip of the defenders of U.S. imperialism, so that reduced the options to Browder or Roosevelt, end quote. Trotsky went on to suggest that the Socialist Workers' Party should give, quote, critical support, end quote, to Earl Browder. He argued that, quote, the CP leaders had begun to oppose U.S. entry into the war, end quote, and this fact would facilitate the work of the Trotskyists in making overtures to communist workers and others under the Communist Party's influence. However, as Dobbs noted, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party delegation did not favor the tactic of critical support to Browder. We felt that it would run into indignation among anti-Stalinist militants in the trade unions, end quote. Trotsky did not insist on his formula, regarding his formula as a matter of, quote, tactics, end quote, not of principle. In the end, the Socialist Workers' Party did not endorse any presidential candidate. It did run some of its own candidates on a statewide and local level, most notably in Minnesota. There they nominated Grace Carlson for the Senate against nominees of the Farmer Labor Party, Republicans, Democrats, and an independent candidate. She received more votes than the combined total of Thomas and Browder in Minnesota, which the Socialist Workers' Partyers considered a triumph. Dobbs commented that the election showed that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party had become the leading party appealing to radicalized workers in the area, and many were coming closer to the organization upon learning of its program, end quote. In subsequent local and state elections, the Socialist Workers' Party also named a few candidates. The Socialist Workers' Party and the labor movement. During the Second World War, the Socialist Workers' Party concentrated much of its attention on work within the organized labor movement. The surge of militancy which had characterized the 1930s had by no means been totally exhausted, and in fact, membership in trade unions expanded greatly as both employers and the government were more willing than in the past to reach our agreement with their workers' unions to avoid interruptions with wartime production. The Trotskyites and other political groups were able to capitalize on this growth of the labor movement. The Socialist Workers' Party militants continued to develop influence in the industrial unions of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which had begun in the 1930s. As one Socialist Workers' Party observer noted years later, quote, important fractions were built up into auto and maritime and shipbuilding and in other industries. At no time in its history, including the Minneapolis period, had the party been as well rooted in the trade union movement, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party made particular headway in the United Automobile Workers, where their cohorts were led by Ernest Massey. They may well have exaggerated their influence in the United Auto Workers and some other unions in this period. For example, when B.J. Whittick of the Shackmanites went to Detroit and became active in a United Auto Workers local there, he was told by some of his SWP ex-comrades that he was wasting his time since they had the United Auto Workers in Detroit, quote, sewed up, end quote, and would not allow the Shackmanites to make any headway, an assertion which proved untrue. The West Coast Maritime Unions. Another trade union sector in which the Socialist Party was active and reached the highest point of influence during World War II and immediately thereafter was the maritime workers on the Pacific coast. The basis of Trotskyist strength in the sector was their alliance with Harry Lundeberg, head of the Sailors Union of the Pacific, SUP. The Sailors Union of the Pacific was a venerable union established in 1885, which had been greatly weakened by a failed general strike in 1921. For some time thereafter, the IWW's Maritime Transport Workers Union No. 10, as well as the Communist Marine Workers Industrial Union, had some following among the Pacific Coast sailors. All of these elements participated in the revival of the Sailors Union of the Pacific in the 1930s, when the Union had a certain syndicalist coloration, due more, according to Stephen Schwartz, to the syndicalist background of the Scandinavian workers who made up the largest elements in the Sailors Union of the Pacific's membership, than to the remnants of IWW influence. The first upsurge of the Pacific Coast maritime workers was the strike of longshoremen in May 1939, supported by the Socialist Workers' Party and other groups, which obtained a system of joint management union-controlled hiring halls for longshoremen. This was followed by formation early in 1936 of the Maritime Federation of the Pacific, MFP, including the Sailors Union of the Pacific, the Longshoremen, and several small shipboard unions. The first head of the Maritime Federation of the Pacific was the sailor Harry Lundeberg, who was elected head of the Sailors Union of the Pacific later in the year. In December 1936, Lundeberg led the Sailors Union of the Pacific on a successful strike which obtained a system of completely union-controlled hiring halls. Lundeberg was accused by longshore leader Harry Bridges of, quote, betraying, end quote, the strike, since he had settled it without consulting the longshoremen or other unions which had been supporting him. This began a long series of conflicts between the Sailors Union of the Pacific and the longshoremen, by then the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU, of the CIO. The basic cause of the conflict was political. The International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, as well as the Marine Cooks and Stewards and some other smaller unions, were controlled or largely dominated by the Communist Party. The principal leader of those who sought to prevent a general takeover of the maritime unions on the West Coast by the CPUSA was Lundeberg. In this struggle, Lundeberg formed a de facto alliance with the Trotskyists, who had been able during 1936 to establish a modicum of influence in the Pacific maritime field. Lundeberg named Barney Mays, a Trotskyist and the son-in-law of Jack London, as editor of Voice of the Federation. Where is it? What's it called? What's the M? Sorry, I'm trying to keep these acronyms in place. The Maritime Federation of the Pacific. The Maritime Federation of the Pacific's newspaper. Mays had as his chief assistant Joseph Hansen, who was many years later to emerge as the principal successor to James P. Cannon as head of the Socialist Workers' Party. Other Trotskyists who were active in the Sailors Union of the Pacific and other Pacific maritime unions in the period were Tom Carey and Frank Lovell. Non-Trotskyist leaders in the Sailors Union of the Pacific and some other unions of the Maritime Federation supported a number of Trotskyist positions. Thus, a number of them telegraphed their support of Trotsky to the Dewey Commission hearing in Mexico City. West Coast Sailor, the Sailors Union of the Pacific newspaper, denounced the Stalinist provocation which had led to the May 1937 uprising of anarchists, Pumists, and others in Barcelona. The Lundeberg Socialist Workers' Party alliance in the maritime field was extended to some degree to the Atlantic coast when in 1939 Socialist Workers' Party member Tom Carey was sent by Lundeberg to New York to help efforts to organize the new Seafarers International Union. The Seafarers International Union had recently been chartered as a nation-wide organization by the American Federation of Labor, with the Sailors' Union of the Pacific as its core. Carey undertook to edit Seafarer's Log, the Seafarers International Union's newly established paper. The struggle of the Lunenburg Socialist Workers' Party coalition reached a high point during World War II when the Sailors' Union of the Pacific reacted strongly against Harry Bridges' ardent acceptance after June 1941 of the, quote, no strike pledge, end quote, which the Roosevelt administration was encouraging. During that period, Socialist Workers' Party leader Frank Lovell published a book, Maritime, under the pseudonym Frederick J. Lang, in which he strongly supported Lunenburg's role. The last achievement of the Socialist Workers' Party Lunenburg alliance was a victorious strike of the Sailors' Union of the Pacific and the Seafarers International Union in September 1946. The strike was followed by a defeat of a strike called by Bridges. Thereafter, the intense hostility between Lunenburg and Bridges' forces began to be modified. At that point, apparently, Lunenburg felt no further need for his Trotskyist allies, and by 1949 there had been an open break between Lunenburg and the Socialist Workers' Party maritime cadre. The break brought the virtual total disappearance of any further Trotskyist influence among the maritime workers. The Teamsters Union. Certainly one of the major activities of leaders and members of the Socialist Workers' Party during World War II was the defense of those of its major figures who were indicted and in some cases sent to jail by the United States government. The origins of this persecution and prosecution of the Socialist Workers' Party are to be found in the activities of a small number of Trotskyists, particularly Farrell Dobbs in the American Federation of Labor's International Brotherhood of Teamsters. The events of the early 1940s had their antecedents half a decade before. In 1935 to 36, International Brotherhood of Teamsters President Daniel Tobin made his first effort to destroy the influence which the Trotskyists had acquired a year or so before among the Teamsters of Minneapolis. Daniel Tobin chartered a rival Local 500 to Local 574, which was controlled by the Trotskyists, and sent in a leading organizer, Meyer Lewis, to try to destroy Local 574. This move encountered resistance not only among the Teamsters, but from virtually the whole labor movement of the city. As a consequence, Daniel Tobin backed down, merging Locals 574 and 500 into a new Local 544, which the Trotskyists continued to control. The reunification of the Minneapolis Teamsters met some opposition within the Socialist Workers' Party. Cannon himself had doubts about it. Dobbs wrote that, quote, the leading party comrades, including Jim, were hesitant about our proposed settlement with Tobin. There was concern among them as to whether we could survive under the terms involved. It might be better, they felt, to go down fighting than to risk being compromised as revolutionists if the arrangement went wrong on us, end quote. Cannon went to Minneapolis to confer with the local Trotskyists. They finally convinced Cannon that they would be able to control the proposed new Local 544 and that they would not sully their revolutionary honor by agreeing to merge the old Local 574 with Dan Tobin's Local 500. When the matter was put to the rank and file of Local 574, the merger was approved by a vote of about 2-1. For a while after this incident, Daniel Tobin refused to interfere further with the Trotskyites' control of the Minneapolis Teamsters. When a dissident group within Local 544 brought a court suit against its leaders alleging misuse of union funds and seeking to have the local put into receivership, Tobin refused to give any support to the maneuver. As a result of this case, the Dunn brothers were fined $56,000 and Carl Skoglund was removed from the presidency of Local 544 by the court on the grounds that since he was not a United States citizen, he was not qualified according to the Constitution of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters to be head of a local. Subsequently, basing himself in Local 544 and the Minneapolis Joint Council of the Teamsters, Dobbs was one of the principal leaders of Local 544, began to undertake unionization of the over-the-road truck drivers. These more or less long-distance drivers had until then been largely ignored by the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Daniel Tobin had doubts about the feasibility of organizing them. Dobbs argued that they were the key to the expansion of the size and power of the Brotherhood. Not only were they themselves a substantial part of the total number of Teamsters, but if they were unionized, they could serve as, quote, missionaries, end quote, for the Union in unorganized cities and towns since they had contacts in virtually all parts of the country. Dobbs succeeded first in establishing the North Central District Drivers' Council, composed of Teamster locals from the Dakotas, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Upper Michigan. This organization, which was later transformed into the Central States Drivers' Council, sought to establish a pattern of regional bargaining for the over-the-road truck drivers. When the employers refused to negotiate on that basis, Dobbs succeeded in getting an agreement between the International Brotherhood of Teamsters locals in Chicago, the hub of over-the-road trucking in the Midwest, to refuse to handle the trucks belonging to firms which had not joined in the regional collective bargaining process. This strategy soon won victory for the Union. One of the young organizers who was assigned by the International Brotherhood of Teamsters to help Farrell Dobbs in his campaign was James Hoffa, who had had some experience in Michigan with a considerably more limited effort in the same direction. Many years later, James Hoffa paid tribute to the leadership of Farrell Dobbs in this organizing campaign. Quote, I refuse, therefore, to make any judgment about Farrell Dobbs. The fact that his exhortations in later years left me unmoved and that his logic eluded me does not mean he has not made a serious contribution to human thinking and striving. We cannot measure with today's yardsticks matters that should be viewed through the transit of time. As a fellow labor organizer, I view Farrell Dobbs subjectively. He was one heck of a fine labor organizer, period. On this matter only am I qualified to speak, end quote. Jimmy Hoffa. As a result of Dobbs' success in his organizing efforts on behalf of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, President Daniel Tobin temporarily overcame his dislike of Trotskyism sufficiently to offer Dobbs a position as general organizer of the Union. Dobbs assumed that post on May 1, 1939. At the time of the establishment of the Socialist Workers' Party in January 1938, it had been decided that ultimately Farrell Dobbs would move to New York to take over the post of National Labor Secretary of the party. Pending his arrival in New York, B.J. Whittick, one of the Socialist Workers' Party's leading labor journalists, served in Farrell Dobbs's place as a member of the political committee of the Socialist Workers' Party. A few months after Farrell Dobbs had assumed the position of general organizer of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, he and other party leaders came to the conclusion that it was time for him to resign his union position and to assume his post in the party. Daniel Tobin had clearly indicated his support for President Roosevelt's policy of aid to the Allies in the Second World War, and a clash between Tobin and Dobbs seemed more or less inevitable. As a consequence, Farrell Dobbs presented his resignation as a general organizer in a meeting with Tobin in December 1939. In that session, Tobin used all of his quite extensive powers of persuasion to try to convince Farrell Dobbs to stay with the Union and give up his proposed political activities. As Dobbs described the meeting, Tobin seemed genuinely perplexed that a rising young figure in his union would turn down a most promising career in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters leadership to assume what certainly seemed to Tobin to be a thankless task in a relatively obscure political group with strange ideas. The persecution and prosecution of the Socialist Workers' Party. A bit more than a year after the resignation of Farrell Dobbs from his post in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Tobin began a campaign once and for all to destroy Trotskyist influence among the Minneapolis Teamsters. This was soon followed by government prosecution not only of the Minneapolis Teamsters leaders, but of most of the top figures in the Socialist Workers' Party. Ralph and Estelle James have noted that in April 1941, quote, a subcommittee of the General Executive Board conducted by Secretary-Treasurer John Gillespie met in Chicago with all concerned to examine whether 544's officers were, quote, communistic, alien, and grossly negligent and inefficient, end quote. The hearing centered totally about the first of these charges, and the results were largely predetermined, for the Dunes had made no secret of their political affiliation, end quote. 2 months later, the General Executive Board proclaimed the Socialist Workers' Party to be a, quote, subversive revolutionary party, end quote, and demanded that all International Brotherhood of Teamsters officers resign from it. At the same time, it was decreed that Local 544 should be placed under a, quote, trusteeship, end quote, to be named by President Tobin, in spite of the fact that the officers of the local had gone so far as to formally resign from the Socialist Workers' Party following the March 1941 meeting of the General Board's subcommittee. The Trotskyists in Local 544 did not accept this attack without protest. In a meeting on June 9th, attended by Dobbs, who still maintained his membership in the organization, Local 544 voted by a show of hands to withdraw from the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and affiliate with the CIO. Denny Lewis, brother of the CIO chief John L. Lewis and head of the CIO's United Construction Workers Organizing Committee, wired the Local 544 leaders that his organization, quote, will be happy to charter a local union of truck drivers and helpers in the Minneapolis area, end quote, adding, quote, we visualize this move on the part of the truck drivers in Minneapolis into our organization as the first step towards the complete organization of truck drivers in the United States in the CIO, end quote. The CIO quickly established a motor Transport and Allied Workers Industrial Union and sent in CIO staff to help Local 544 and at the same time carry on Teamster organizing activities in CIO centers such as Flint and Pontiac, Michigan. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters countered with its own organizers, and for several months there was a bitter battle between a phantom Local 544 under Tobin's receivership and the old Local 544, now part of the CIO. In late September 1941, final victory was assured to the American Federation of Labor's group in spite of its small membership by its being certified by the Minnesota Department of Labor as the legal bargaining agent for Teamsters in Minneapolis. The battle of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters against Trotskyist domination of its Minneapolis affiliate, together with the government's prosecution of the leaders of Local 544, gained its objectives. By the end of the war, Trotskyist control over the truck drivers of Minneapolis had been almost totally destroyed. The attempt to wrest control of the Minneapolis Teamsters Union from the Trotskyists had little more than started when the United States government brought indictments against 29 leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party. Those indicated included most of the leaders of the Minneapolis of the Minneapolis Teamsters, as well as Grace Carlson and various National Socialist Workers' Party leaders, including James Cannon, Socialist Workers' Party National Secretary Felix Morrow, editor of the Militant, Albert Goldman, member of the Militant editorial board, and Dobbs, National Labor Secretary of the party. The New York Times reported that, quote, the indictment charged that members of the Socialist Workers' Party sought to be placed in key positions in all major industries, particularly those of transportation, shipping, manufacturing, farming, mining, and lumbering, so they could induce laborers to join their party, end quote. The indictment alleged that, quote, the defendants would seek to bring about, whenever the time seemed propitious, an armed revolution against the government of the United States. The party would and did attempt to bring about control of the militia by workers and laborers, and procured certain explosives, firearms, and ammunition, and military equipment, and was organized into military groups, united, armed, and drilled under the name of Union Defense Guard, end quote. This claim clearly referred to the groups which the Minneapolis Teamsters had organized from time to time to protect themselves from attacks from employer agents or strong-armed groups of rival unions. The indictment said that the Socialist Workers' Party claimed that the Union Defense Guard, quote, was to guard against violent attempts to destroy trade unions, end quote. But, quote, in truth, they were to be used to overthrow and put down by force the constitutional government of the United States, end quote. It concluded that, quote, the members accepted as ideal the formula of the Russian Revolution of 1917, and certain defendants went from the Twin Cities to Mexico City, where they received advice and counsel from Leon Trotsky, end quote. The indictments against the Socialist Workers' Party leaders were drawn under two laws, a Civil War statute against sedition, and the Smith Act, passed in the previous year and many years later virtually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The trial of the Socialist Workers' Party leaders was a cause célèbre for them and their opponents. Their prosecution was strongly applauded by the Communist Party. Oh, that's good. Which itself was... Jesus Christ. The trial of the Socialist Workers' Party was a cause célèbre for them and their opponents. Their prosecution was strongly applauded by the Communist Party, which itself had to suffer many indictments under the Smith Act a few years later. However, some of those whom the government had hoped to get to testify against the Trotskyists refused to do so. Years later, James Hoffa wrote that, quote, at the time of the trial, I was asked, along with other Detroit officials, to testify against the Doon brothers, which we declined to do so. One second, I gotta save this to my computer. One second, sorry. Okay, back to the text. Ralph and Estelle James have summed up the results of the Minneapolis trials. Quote, charges against 5 of the defendants were dismissed by the judge due to lack of evidence, and 5 other defendants, including Miles Dunn, were found innocent by the jury. Those remaining, most notably Vince Doon and Farrell Dobbs, were convicted and given varying sentences of 12 to 18 months duration. The sentences were upheld on appeal in 1943. Many of the old 54 local leaders spent little, if any, time in jail, but by the trial's end their spirit was broken and their power destroyed. Grant Dune had committed suicide during the course of a nervous breakdown. Another defendant was acquitted of the conspiracy charge but received a 5-year prison term for, quote, embezzling, end quote, union dues and other properties which he had refused to turn over to the Teamsters, end quote. Ralph and Estelle James. One of those who suffered most severely was the Teamster leader Carl Skoglund. The vengeful International Brotherhood of Teamsters saw to it that Skoglund could not obtain a job once he had been released from prison. Wherever he found employment, the Teamsters mounted a picket line. He finally went to New Jersey, where he worked in a camp maintained by the Socialist Workers' Party. Then the Immigration Service moved against Skoglund, trying to deport him as a, quote, undesirable alien, end quote. He was kept several months in Ellis Island and was even put on a boat, ready to sail, when at the last moment, with the help of Norman Thomas, an injunction was obtained just in time to get him removed from the ship and freed. 18 defendants were sent to jail, all being released somewhat early for good behavior. The 6 sentenced to 1 year, Harry de Boer, Clarence Hamill, Edward Palmquist, Carl Kuhn, Alfred Russell, and Oscar Schoenfeld, were released in October 1944. The other 12, Cannon, Jake Cooper, Oscar Coover, Sr., Farrell Dobbs, Vincent Dune, Max Geldman, Albert Goldman, Emil Hansen, Carlos Hudson, Felix Morrow, Carl Skoglund, and Grace Carlson were finally let go on January 24, 1945, after being held for not quite 14 months. Anyway, the Socialist Workers' Party campaigned around the Minneapolis trial. As soon as their leaders had been indicted, the Socialist Workers' Party mounted a major campaign in their defense. A Civil Rights Defense Committee was organized under the chairmanship of James T. Farrell, the famous novelist who was at the time, quote, a dependable ally of the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. James T. Farrell's committee was able to mobilize very considerable support among intellectuals for the Trotskyists being prosecuted by the Roosevelt administration. At the same time, they were also able to rally very substantial backing in the organized labor movement, particularly from the CIO unions, in some of which the party had a modicum of organization, but also from such American Federation of Labor organizations as the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union. The Trotskyist principal appeal within the organized labor was the feeling of labor solidarity, arguing that the attack on the Minneapolis Teamsters was a clear case of a governmental attempt to destroy an important trade union. Within the labor movement, the Trotskyists met their most bitter opposition not from conservative bureaucrats but from the Communist Party and the unions which the Communist Party controlled or influenced. At the same time, the Stalinists attacked many of those who expressed support for the Trotskyists, at one point even suggesting that Norman Thomas, who had backed the Defense Committee, ought himself to be prosecuted under the Smith Act. One second, I have to save this. Okay. The support which they were able to rally in the intellectual community and the labor movement perhaps prevented the outlawing of the Socialist Workers' Party. There were certain rumors at the time that the Roosevelt administration was planning to take further steps against the Trotskyites in addition to the trials. They did in fact suffer some other forms of persecution, including the seizure of some issues of the Militant by the post office authorities and the subsequent suspension of second-class mailing privileges of the newspaper. Later, the Socialist Workers' Party's theoretical organ, Fourth International, was also banned from the mails, an action which brought the quite anti-Trotskyist weekly New Leader, organ of the Social Democratic Federation, to observe that, quote, apparently the post office has arbitrarily extended its ban on all publications of the Trotskyist group, end quote. It added that, quote, the last issues of the Militant, the weekly paper, have been released for mailing about 10 days after publication date, ... If the post office found nothing to stop publication, the policy of holding up each issue for a Washington decision is an arbitrary censorship over a publication which may have dangerous repercussions, end quote. The reasons for the persecution of the Trotskyists. The legal prosecution of the Socialist Workers' Party and the harassment of its periodicals by the U.S. Post Office were quite clearly cases of persecution, and they were rather unique during World War II. The Roosevelt administration did not engage in the kind of grotesque violations of civil liberties which the Wilson administration had carried out during and after World War I. No other radical group, whether it be the Communist Party, the Socialists, who were opposed to entry into the war before Pearl Harbor and remained very critical of the conduct of the war thereafter, or the Shachtmanites and other dissident Trotskyist groups, suffered at the hand of the government, as did the Socialist Workers' Party. This fact raises the question of why the Roosevelt administration took such measures against the Socialist Workers' Party. The reason, most widely accepted then and later by both members and leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party and by people outside the party, was expressed at the time of the indictment of the Trotskyist leaders by Albert Goldman. He commented then that the indictment, quote, was an attempt by President Roosevelt to pay political debts to Daniel J. Tobin, head of the American Federation of Labor Teamsters Union, end quote. Tobin was indeed a person to whom Roosevelt owed considerable political debts. Tobin had headed the Democratic Party's campaign in organized labor to win support for Roosevelt's re-election for a third term in 1940. He was known as one of the most thoroughgoing Democrats in the organized labor movement. Furthermore, Tobin strongly supported Roosevelt's policies of aid to Great Britain in the months before Pearl Harbor. The American Civil Liberties Union, which came to the support of the indicted Trotskyists, issued a statement emphasizing its belief that the indictment of the Trotskyist leaders was designed specifically to help Tobin's attempt to take control of the Minneapolis Teamsters from the Socialist Workers' Party. It noted, according to Ralph and Estelle James, quote, communications between Tobin and Roosevelt, wherein Tobin had described the flight of 544 to the CIO as, quote, a regrettable and dangerous condition, ... We feel that while our country is in a dangerous position, those disturbers who believe in the policies of foreign radical governments must be in some way prevented from pursuing their dangerous course, end quote. Roosevelt quickly obliged by agreeing that jurisdictional fights were not desirable, end quote. The American Civil Liberties Union report went on to say that, quote, it seems reasonable to conclude that the government injected itself into the inter-union controversy in order to promote the interest of the one side which supported the administration's foreign and domestic policies, ... Our conclusion is reinforced by the fact that it has been a matter of common knowledge for some years that the Socialist Workers' Party, an insignificant little group of extremists, has been strongly represented in the Minneapolis labor movement, ... Nothing charged in the indictment is of recent origin. The situation in Minneapolis is no different from that obtaining over the past 5 or 10 years, end quote. Ralph and Estelle James, writing in the mid-1960s, noted that, quote, Farrell Dobbs today disputes the view that of the American Civil Liberties Union and other liberal groups that the Justice Department moves were political payoffs from Roosevelt to Tobin. Farrell Dobbs believes that the war and general class issues motivated the government's attack on the Trotskyists, ... end quote. However, the facts remain that it was only the Socialist Workers' Partiers who were in conflict with Roosevelt's ally, Tobin, and that although several other radical groups were at least as vociferously against Roosevelt's policies as were the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party, only the Socialist Workers' Party leaders were indicted by the Roosevelt administration. The Socialist Workers' Party and the Civil Rights Movement. During World War II, the Socialist Workers' Party also got more or less extensively involved for the first time in the black civil rights struggle. Until then, the Socialist Workers' Party had had very little black membership and had only had 2 blacks in its leadership. C.L.R. James, a British West Indian who had migrated to the United States from Great Britain some years before, and Ernest McKinney. Ernest McKinney. During World War II, both of these men were with the Shachtmanites. The Socialist Workers' Party's weekly newspaper, Socialist Appeal, until February 1st, 1941, the Militant, thereafter, kept close track of the events within the black community and of events and indictments affecting blacks. It carried many articles, the largest number of them by George Brightman, writing under the name Albert Parker. The newspaper and the party strongly supported the March on Washington movement organized and led in 1941 by the labor leader A. Philip Randolph, although they strongly opposed the compromise between A. Philip Randolph and President Roosevelt, which resulted in the actual descent on the Capitol being canceled. Subsequently, the Militant reported extensively on 2 national conferences held by the organization, which had originally been built up around the idea of a March on Washington. The Militant paid special attention to segregation of and discrimination against blacks in the armed forces. It also dealt with the problem of the slowness of integration of minorities into the civilian workforce, particularly in defense industries. In this connection, it commented favorably on efforts of various unions, particularly the United Auto Workers, to place black workers in such jobs and to make it possible for them to receive training as skilled workers. There was continuous insistence on the ineffectiveness of the Fair Employment Practices Committee set up by President Roosevelt as part of the agreement calling off the 1941 March on Washington. The paper also reported and commented on race riots which took place during the war, particularly in Detroit and Harlem, as well as, quote, Zoot Suit, end quote, incidents involving Mexican Americans in the Los Angeles area. The paper blamed these events on the attempts of the capitalists to keep the working class divided, emphasizing frequently that people acquire racial prejudices rather than being born with racial prejudices. In addition to constant coverage of the struggles of blacks in the party newspaper, the Socialist Workers' Party published at least 3 pamphlets on the subject during the war, all of them written by George Brightman. The first, Defend the Negro Sailors on the USS Philadelphia, was put out in November 1940 and dealt with the court-martialing of a number of black sailors who had protested against the Jim Crow conditions they were subject to in the Navy. The second, The Negro March on Washington, published in June 1941, supported the movement for the march but was very critical of the supposed lack of militancy of A. Philip Randolph and other leaders of the effort. A third pamphlet, Negroes in the Post-War Period, issued in June 1943, dealt more generally with the black struggle, emphasizing particularly the palliative nature of the moves taken by the Roosevelt administration during the war and their failure to challenge the fundamental problems of segregation and discrimination. The Socialist Workers' Party was very critical of those who argued that there should be a dampening of the civil rights struggle in the name of supporting the war effort. It was particularly strong in its attacks on Communist Party arguments to this effect, especially by such black Communist Party leaders as James Ford and Benjamin Davis. The campaigns of the Socialist Workers' Party on behalf of black causes during the war resulted in modest gains by the party in terms of membership and influence among the blacks. Fred Stanton has noted that the party recruited, quote, hundreds of black and working class members, end quote. Among the new members was Dr. Edgar B. Kramer, a black doctor who resisted the draft on grounds of discrimination against blacks in the armed services, was indicted but won dismissal of all charges when he was defended by the Socialist Workers' Party and the American Civil Liberties Union. Edgar B. Kramer joined the Socialist Workers' Party in 1943 and wrote a column for the Militant under the name Charles Jackson, dealing principally with black issues. Gains by the Socialist Workers' Party during and after World War II. The Socialist Workers' Party was able to make considerable progress in membership as well as in influence during and immediately after World War II. James Cannon claimed in July 1945 that, quote, we are now recruiting new members at the rate of 300 per year, and the rate of recruiting is increasing from month to month, end quote. And that, quote, our new recruits are predominantly proletarian trade union militants, the very type out of which the future party of the revolution must be constructed, end quote. About 2 years later, when the apportionment of delegates to the Second World Congress of the Fourth International was being discussed, the Socialist Workers' Party claimed a membership of about 1,500. Many years later, Fred Stanton said that the Socialist Workers' Party membership had been about 600 after the Shachtmanite split and about 1,500 by the end of the war. The circulation of the party's press was also growing during these years. Speaking on July 25, 1945, Cannon noted that, quote, a year ago the National Committee rather hesitatingly asked the membership to get 3,000 new subscribers, end quote, for the Militant, with the result that, quote, the membership responded with a total of about 7,500 new subscriptions. He added that, quote, again this year a goal of 10,000 new subscribers was set by the party leadership, and you responded with more than 22,000. Fund campaigns with goals undreamed of in the old days have been oversubscribed in every case, end quote. A few months later, Cannon reported to the New York membership of the Socialist Workers' Party that, quote, the circulation of the Militant is held down to 31,000 now only because the Prince Hop can't handle anymore. But as soon as we make the necessary mechanical arrangements, we are going to put on another subscription campaign for 10,000 new readers. We are all confident that by January 1st we will have a Militant circulation of 60,000, end quote. However, the party was a victim of substantial post-war inflation. In October 1946, the Socialist Workers' Party was forced to take drastic steps to cut back on its expenditures. As Cannon informed Charles Curtis, a National Committee member from Los Angeles, they decided to cut the Militant from 8 to 6 pages an issue, probably to reduce the size of Fourth International, temporarily to suspend all further publications by the party's pioneer publishers, to cut the Socialist Workers' Party staff, quote, to the absolute minimum, end quote, and to, quote, ask the convention to authorize the collection of another fund of $20,000, end quote. There is no indication of how long these measures remained in effect. The Theses on the American Revolution. About 15 months after the end of World War II, the Socialist Workers' Party adopted what was described as, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party's basic programmatic document of the post-war period, end quote, entitled, quote, Theses on the American Revolution, end quote. It was basically written by James Cannon and was adopted by the party's 12th National Congress in November 1946. It was a somewhat apocalyptic document which predicted the absolute impossibility of any further stabilization of capitalism, the near certainty of World War III in the very near future, and the early advent of revolution in the United States and therefore throughout the world. This document reflected the perspective at the time of not only the majority of the Socialist Workers' Party leadership, but of most of their European counterparts as well. The first of the 15, quote, theses, end quote, which make up the document ended with the unequivocal assertion that, quote, the blind alley in which world capitalism has arrived and the U.S. with it excludes a new organic era of capitalist stabilization. The dominant world position of American imperialism now accentuates and aggravates the death agony of capitalism as a whole, end quote. Theses 2 through 5 trace the events of the interwar period. First, the prosperity of the 1920s, based in the United States principally on the expansion of the domestic market and followed by the Great Depression, out of which the U.S. economy was rescued only by war preparations. Thesis 6 dealt with the war and post-war situation of the United States economy and concluded, among other things, that, quote, every single factor underlying the current, quote, peacetime, end quote, prosperity is ephemeral. This country has emerged not richer from the Second World War, as was the case in the 20s, but poorer in a far more impoverished world, ... The basic conditions that precipitated the 1929 crisis when American capitalism enjoyed its fullest health not only persist but have grown more malignant, end quote. Thesis 7 summed up the document's cataclysmic prediction about the future of the United States and world economy. Quote, the following conclusion flows from the objective situation. U.S. imperialism, which proved incapable of recovering from its crisis and stabilizing itself in the 10-year period preceding the outbreak of the Second World War, is heading for an even more catastrophic explosion in the current post-war era. The cardinal factor which will light the fuse is this: the home market, after an initial and an artificial revival, must contract. The home market cannot expand as it did in the 20s. What is really in store is not unbounded prosperity, but a short-lived boom. In the wake of the boom must come another crisis and depression, which will make the 1929 to 32 conditions look prosperous by comparison, end quote. Thesis 8 argued that, quote, the impending economic paroxysms, end quote, were leading, quote, the American monopolist, end quote, to preparation for war with the Soviet Union. The document predicted that such a war not only would not solve U.S. domestic problems, but also would meet, quote, fierce resistance, end quote, not only from, quote, the peoples of the USSR, end quote, but also from, quote, the European and colonial masses who do not want to be the slaves of Wall Street, end quote, and within the United States itself. As a consequence, the quote, workers' struggle for power in the U.S. is not a perspective of a distant and hazy future, but the realistic program of our epoch, end quote. Theses 9 and 10 dealt with the interconnection between the revolution in the United States and in other parts of the world. Regardless of whether the revolutionary movement starts in Europe, quote, colonial, end quote, areas of the United States, regardless of whether the revolutionary movement starts in Europe, quote, colonial, end quote, areas, or the United States, quote, the issue of socialism or capitalism will not be finally decided until it is decided in the U.S., end quote. Thesis 10 added that, quote, the revolutionary victory of the workers in the U.S. will seal the doom of the senile bourgeois regimes in every part of our planet, and of the Stalinist bureaucracy if it still exists at the time, end quote. Thesis 11 dealt with the, quote, danger of bureaucratic degeneration after the revolutionary victory, end quote. It declared, quote, that this can only arise from privileges which are in turn based on backwardness, poverty, and universal scarcities. Such a danger could have no material foundation within the United States. Here the triumphant workers' and farmers' government would from the very beginning be able to organize socialist production on far higher levels than under capitalism, and virtually overnight assure such a high standard of living for the masses as would strip privileges in the material sense of any serious meaning whatever. End quote. Thesis 12 argued that objective conditions had prepared the United States working class for revolution. For one thing, quote, the numerical strength and social weight of the American working class, greatly increased by the war, is overwhelming in the country's life, end quote. For another, the post-war wave of strikes indicated that the workers were ready to fight to preserve their relatively high living standards, and that, quote, in the given situation, therefore, the relatively high living standard of American workers is a revolutionary and not, as is commonly believed, a conservative factor, end quote. Furthermore, the homogenization of the American working class, resulting from immigrants being succeeded by their children, and the growing incorporation of the blacks in the labor movement strengthened the revolutionary potential of the American workers. Furthermore, this thesis argued, quote, the American workers have the advantage of being comparatively free, especially among the younger and most militant layers, from reformist prejudices. The class as a whole has not been infected with the debilitating poison of reformism, either of the classic, quote, socialist, end quote, variety or the latter-day Stalinist brand. As a consequence, once they proceed to action, they more readily accept the most radical solutions, end quote. Thesis 13 dealt with the alleged, quote, backwardness, end quote, of the U.S. working class and argued that had been disproven by the rapid growth of the trade union movement since the mid-1930s. It predicted that, quote, under the impact of great advances and pressing necessities, the American workers will advance beyond the limits of trade unionism and acquire political class consciousness and organization in a similar sweeping movement. End quote. Thesis 14 established that, quote, the decisive instrument of the proletarian revolution is the party of the class-conscious vanguard, end quote. So, Thesis 14 established that, quote, the decisive instrument of the proletarian revolution is the party of the class-conscious vanguard, end quote. It went on to argue that the fact that such a party is quite small does not militate against its ultimate victory, as was demonstrated with the case of the Bolsheviks in 1917. It concluded that, quote, in the U.S., all the conditions are in the process of unfolding for the rapid transformation of the organized vanguard from a propaganda group to a mass party strong enough to lead the revolutionary struggle for power, end quote. Obviously, as Thesis 15 proudly proclaimed, quote, the Revolutionary Vanguard Party, destined to lead this tumultuous revolutionary movement in the U.S., does not have to be created. It already exists, and its name is the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. The document concluded with the observation that, quote, the task of the Socialist Workers' Party consists simply in this: to remain true to its program and banner, to render it more precise with each new development, and apply it correctly in the class struggle, and to expand and grow with the growth of the revolutionary mass movement, always aspiring to lead it to victory in the struggle for political power, end quote. The Goldman-Morrow split. World War II was not over before the Socialist Workers' Party was undergoing another factional dispute, which ended in a new split in the party's ranks. It centered on somewhat the same issues as those which had caused the Shachtmanite schism half a decade earlier and directly involved the question of relations between the Socialist Workers' Party and the Workers' Party. The leading dissidents on this occasion were Albert Goldman and Felix Morrow. The new dispute probably had its origins in personal disagreements which arose among the Trotskyists incarcerated in Sandstone Prison. Subsequently, soon after leaving prison, James Cannon wrote, referring to Albert Goldman by one of his, quote, party names, and, quote, Morrison, that, quote, all political and personal relations between us and Morrison, which didn't amount to much from the first day, were completely discontinued as far back as June. And between us and Morrow, about 90%, end quote. He added that, quote, we left Sandstone with the conviction that personal relations with Morrison had been disrupted and broken off forever without any possibility of repair, and that political relations henceforth can only be of the most formal business-like character. We have conducted ourselves since our return from this standpoint, end quote. The first issue raised by Goldman and Morrow concerned, quote, the organizational question, end quote, that is, the democratic centralist theory and practice of the Socialist Workers' Party. The two leaders complained about the, quote, bureaucratic, end quote, nature of James Cannon's control over the party apparatus. These issues were raised as early as the 11th Convention of the Socialist Workers' Party in November 1940 by supporters of the Goldman-Morrow point of view, although the two principal leaders were still in jail at the time. The existence of a new factional lineup in the Socialist Workers' Party became public knowledge for all who read the paper's publications by a statement dated on April 16, 1945, entitled On the Internal Situation, which was published in the May 1945 issue of Fourth International. This statement was a species of truce between, quote, the majority and minority point of view as developed in the 11th Party Convention, end quote. In essence, this statement said that, quote, there are no clearly defined differences at the present time on programmatic questions, end quote. Sorry, one second. In essence, this statement said that, quote, there are no clearly defined differences at the present time on programmatic questions, end quote, and that in the light of that, quote, it is possible and obligatory to collaborate harmoniously and constructively on the basis of the convention discussions, end quote, and that, quote, there is no basis for sharp factional struggle or for the existence of factional formations in the party ranks, end quote. Programmatic, end quote, differences in the Morrow-Goldman split. The, quote, programmatic, end quote, differences arose very soon. The issues concerning the Trotskyist perspective on the immediate post-war world and resulting ideas about short and middle-run strategy which the Socialist Workers' Party and its European partners should follow were of fundamental significance for the whole international Trotskyist movement. The questions Goldman and Morrow raised were widely debated among Trotskyists in Europe as well as in the United States and haunted the movement for a generation. Felix Morrow and Albert Goldman were in fundamental disagreement with the, quote, catastrophic, end quote, perspective of the Socialist Workers' Party leadership and that of most of the Fourth International. More specifically, they were very much against the, quote, theses on the American Revolution, end quote, adopted late in 1946 and which had been in process of formulation for as long as 3 years before that. Morrow-Goldman disagreed with the majority of the Socialist Workers' Party leadership on at least 4 major points. Morrow and Goldman believed that post-war Europe would experience a strong economic recovery based in large part on aid from the United States. Morrow and Goldman argued that, quote, bourgeois democracy, end quote, would be restored in Europe rather than the dictatorships foreseen by the Socialist Workers' Party majority. Morrow and Goldman maintained that the revolution was not imminent in Western Europe, but rather was a matter of at least several decades. Finally, they argue that during this considerable period of time, the best policy for the Trotskyist parties was to push for the utmost extension and expansion of, quote, bourgeois democracy, end quote, as the only feasible way of showing its inadequacies for the achievement of socialism. Morrow argued against the majority's insistence that the United States intended to, quote, dismember, end quote, the European economies once America had defeated the Nazis. Morrow argued that, quote, in the long run, of course, U.S. imperialism can solve none of Europe's economic problems, ... It is not enough, however, to state this long-term perspective. We must also estimate accurately the short-term perspective. The short-term perspective is that American imperialism will provide food and economic aid to Europe and will thus, for a time, appear before the European masses in a very different guise than German imperialism. Unlike Nazi occupation, American occupation will be followed by improvement in food supplies and in the economic situation generally. Where the Nazis removed factory machinery and transportation equipment, the Americans will bring factory machinery and transportation equipment in, ... end quote. Morrow and Goldman also argue that, quote, bourgeois democracy, end quote, would exist in Western Europe for some time to come. Morrow argued that, quote, with the collapse of fascism and the rise of the masses again to their feet, the question of what is to come can only be answered in terms of the situation of the revolutionary Marxist parties in the various European countries, ... No such mass revolutionary parties exist yet. The struggle of the masses is limited by the fact that it still accepts the leadership of the reformist parties. The objective resultant is bourgeois democracy, end quote. Morrow summed up his argument concerning the persistence for some time of, quote, bourgeois democracy, end quote, thus, quote, in sum, the minority saw an evolution toward bourgeois democracy as the objective resultant of one, the rising struggle of the proletariat, and two, the limitations of that struggle due to the present hegemony of the Stalinist and Social Democrats and the smallness of the Fourth International parties. 3. The resistance of French imperialism supporting itself on the masses to U.S. domination. 4. The ability of U.S. imperialism to shift from methods of military dictatorship to bourgeois democratic methods under the given conditions. 5. The pressure of the United States and British masses in opposition to imposition of dictatorships, end quote. European economic recovery and the reestablishment of liberal democracy meant, in the view of Felix Morrow and Albert Goldman. I can't remember. Just says Felix Morrow, but Albert Goldman. There we are. I did remember. European economic recovery and the reestablishment of liberal democracy meant, in the view of Felix Morrow and Albert Goldman, that the European Socialist Revolution, which the Socialist Workers' Party and the Fourth International majority had been predicting as an immediate result of the end of the war, would at best be very considerably postponed. Most particularly, hope for the new German Revolution, which had been at the center of the predictions of the Trotskyist optimistic view, was mistaken. On this point, Morrow wrote that, quote, you wrote all this without a single reference to the fact that the German proletariat would begin its life after Nazi defeat under military occupation, without a revolutionary party, and without the slightest attempt at appraising the state of class consciousness of the German proletariat after 11 years of Nazism, end quote. Morrow also commented on what he thought were the roots of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Fourth International's high expectations for a German revolution. Morrow said, quote, "To put it bluntly, all the phrases in its prediction about the German Revolution, that the proletariat would from the first play a decisive role, soldiers' committees, workers' and peasant soviets, etc., were copied down once again in January 1945 by the European Secretariat from the 1938 program of the Fourth International. 7 years and such years had passed by, but the European Secretariat did not change a comma. Exactly the same piece of copying had been done by the Socialist Workers' Party majority in its October 1943 plenum resolution, in spite of the criticisms of the minority." End quote. If continued democratic regimes and not revolution were the immediate prospect, Morrow argued that the tactic of the Trotskyists ought to be to exploit these facts, not deny them. He wrote that, quote, "If the masses have democratic illusions, what follows? How shall we prove to the masses that their needs cannot be satisfied within the framework of the bourgeois democratic state? This is, of course, not a new problem, and our answer is the Leninist answer. The more complete democracy we can win, the more it will become clear to the workers that it is not their lack of liberties, but capitalism itself which is the cause of their suffering. In the fight for the most complete democracy, the Bolsheviks can demonstrate to the workers that it is the revolutionists and not the reformists who are the most devoted fighters for the needs of the people." End quote. Another, quote, programmatic, end quote, difference of the Morrow and Goldman, of Morrow, Felix Morrow and Albert Goldman, was the Socialist Workers' Party majority concerned the USSR. The Goldman-Morrow group clearly shared Natalia Sadova-Trotsky's doubts about continuing to regard the Soviet Union as even a, quote, degenerated, end quote, worker state. I have a piece by Natalia Trotsky and Grandizzo Muniz. Is it Grandizzo or Grandizzo? I can't remember right now. And they're declaring their resignation from the Fourth International on the grounds that the Fourth International was holding on dogmatically to the degenerated workers' state thesis in spite of what they viewed as substantial evidence leading one to believe that that thesis, if it ever held, and I think they believe it did hold, could no longer be said of the Eastern Bloc. I have it on my channel. Anyway, the Goldman-Morrow group clearly shared Natalia Sadova-Trotsky's doubts about continuing to regard the Soviet Union as even a, quote, degenerated, end quote, worker state. This issue constituted the background rather than the principal issue in the dispute between them and the Canaanite majority of the Socialist Workers' Party. It was not until Albert Goldman had already left the party that Felix Morrow stated at an SWP plenum in May 1946 that he felt that, quote, all the reasons we gave for defending the Soviet Union have disappeared, end quote. Sorry, 1 second. Other issues in the Goldman-Morrow split. As the factional fight developed, the opposition was critical of a number of positions taken by the party. It opposed what it conceived to be the, quote, uncritical, end quote, support given by the Socialist Workers' Party to the faction of the United Automobile Workers Union headed by Walter Reuther. It also challenged the position taken by Kennan and the majority that the U.S. economy was facing a major post-war breakdown. Felix Morrow wrote shortly before his expulsion from the party in November 1946 that, quote, the temporary inflation of the price structure due to wartime shortages is coming to an end, ... by confusing the short-term period of price adjustment with the eventual development of a new economic crisis on the scale of the 1930s, and leaving out entirely the long-term effect of lower prices in facilitating the home market and export in an interim period or at least several years, the political committee conjures up an immediate crisis, end quote. However, most of the controversy centered on the issue of reunification of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Shachtmanites. Goldman and Morrow had apparently had some conversations with leaders of the Workers' Party soon after being released from prison, and in these discussions brought up the possibility of a reunification of the two groups. Albert Goldman and Felix Morrow got enough encouragement from the Workers' Party leaders so that they officially raised the issue at a meeting of the Political Bureau of the Socialist Workers' Party on July 12, 1945. The majority of the political committee decided to refer the matter to the next plenum of the National Committee. Cannon's position on the issue was clear at the time. Cannon reported to a New York Party membership meeting soon afterwards that, quote, the proposal for, quote, unity with the Shachtmanites, end quote, is not a concrete and realistic proposition for our party at the present time, end quote. However, the Workers' Party soon followed up the formal introduction of the unity issue in the Socialist Workers' Party leadership by a letter to that leadership in which they said, among other things, that, quote, the interest of uniting the Fourth Internationalists in the United States on a sound foundation are more important than the regime in the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote, and asking for discussions about the possibility of unity. As a consequence, the Socialist Workers' Party majority had the political committee send a reply in which, according to Cannon, it was stated that, quote, we are in favor of the discussion they propose and will so recommend to our national committee, end quote. Cannon's seeming willingness to, at last, discuss the possibility of unity with the Workers' Party signified no rapprochement with the Goldman-Morrow minority in the Socialist Workers' Party. At the same New York membership meeting, he claimed that, quote, the anarchistic leaders of the minority overestimate the virtues and powers of, quote, direct action, end quote. They think that by openly breaking discipline and laughing at party loyalty, they have thereby eliminated these concepts from party life. I believe they are going to be disappointed. The party is going to pass judgment on them. The party is going to proceed as it always has in such cases, justly but firmly, ... end quote. Subsequently, on September 15, 1945, Shachtman sent another letter asking for discussions of unity and expressing the Workers' Party's people's willingness to, quote, accept discipline as a minority of the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. The political committee of the Socialist Workers' Party on September 21st agreed to discussions. A subcommittee consisting of Cannon, Burt Cochran, and Morris Lewitt then met twice with Shachtman, E.R. McKinney, and Ernest Erber of the Workers' Party. On October 2nd, Cannon reported to his political committee that, quote, the Workers' Party had definitely agreed to accept the status of a disciplined minority, but that they had asked for their own internal bulletin, end quote. Finally, a plenum of the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee met on October 6 to 7th, 1945, to discuss the unity issue. It adopted a resolution sponsored by the majority which decided, quote, A, to endorse the letter and actions of the political committee in response to the letter from the Workers' Party. B, to authorize the political committee to prepare and carry through a thorough discussion and clarification of the theoretical, political, and organizational issues in dispute, and fix the position of the party precisely on every point in preparation for the consideration and action of the next party convention. C, to reject any united front for propaganda. End quote. The decision obviously did not satisfy the Goldman-Morrow minority. On January 26, 1946, quote, the minority faction in the National Committee, end quote, presented a statement of its position. This read, quote, "If in the coming weeks we can see any sign that we can reasonably consider a move on your part towards resumption of negotiations for unity with the Workers' Party, we shall remain in the Socialist Workers' Party in order to work for the cause of unity. If, on the other hand, you give no sign of a desire to reconsider your stand against unity, then our place will be with the Workers' Party," end quote. The political committee, by vote of 6-1, Morrow voting against, adopting a resolution rejecting this, quote, "ultimatum," end quote, on February 12, 1946. The position of the Goldman-Morrow minority had some support within the Fourth International. Natalia Sadova favored reunification of the Socialist Party, Workers' Party, and the Workers' Party. And the Socialist Workers' Party minority also had the backing of the minority element in the French section and of the majority in the Revolutionary Communist Party of Great Britain. Meanwhile, in December 1945, the Control Commission of the Socialist Workers' Party began to look into alleged breaches of discipline by Albert Goldman, Felix Morrow, and some of their supporters. It wrote a report which was submitted to a plenum of the National Committee on May 16, 1946, accusing Albert Goldman and Felix Morrow of having violated Socialist Workers' Party discipline in their relations with the leaders of the Workers' Party. Felix Morrow and most of the minority in New York announced that henceforth they would abide by party discipline. Goldman and others from Chicago, on the other hand, announced that they were going to join the Workers' Party, which they did at the end of the month. Felix Morrow continued his struggle within the Socialist Workers' Party for another 6 months. The November 1946 convention of the party expelled him for, quote, "unauthorized collaboration with Shachtman's Workers' Party," end quote. Felix Morrow did not join the Workers' Party, however. Further Socialist Workers' Party unity negotiations. To the surprise of all concerned, the liquidation of the Goldman-Morrow opposition within the Socialist Workers' Party did not end the discussion of merger with the Workers' Party. The cause of the revival of the issue was a visit to the United States at the end of January 1947 of Michel Pablo Raptis, the Secretary of the Fourth International. Pablo came to discuss details of the Second Congress of the International, which was then being planned for later in 1947. Max Shachtman and the Workers' Party took advantage of his visit to present the case for reintegration of that party into the International. And as a consequence, quote, "through Pablo's intervention, the Workers' Party leadership agreed to the conditions for unity with the Socialist Workers' Party that they had rejected the previous year, in particular giving up their demand for a special internal bulletin for their faction within the Socialist Workers' Party," end quote. This turn of events led to the meeting of a new plenum of the National Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party on February 15th to 16th, 1947. In preparation, Cannon wrote a letter to the members of the National Committee in which he said that according to information provided by Pablo, a majority was assured in the coming Congress of the International to reconfirm, quote, "the orthodox line," end quote, and to, quote, "specifically condemn the theories of bureaucratic collectivism, national revolution, retrogressionism, and the conception of the Stalinist parties in capitalist countries as non-working class bodies," end quote. It was also clearly said that once these positions had been taken, quote, "membership thereafter should be conditional on acceptance of the political and organizational decisions of the Congress and disciplined application of them in all political activity," end quote. Furthermore, the Socialist Workers' Party had been assured that, quote, on the Socialist Workers' Party question, the Congress should condemn the political line developed by the Workers' Party, condemn the split in 1940, the maneuverous character of the unity proposal, and the Goldman split which accompanied it, end quote. Cannon said that the Socialist Workers' Party leaders had worked out with Pablo a, quote, formula, end quote, to govern attendance at the World Congress by parties not then belonging to the International. This formula was that, quote, unaffiliated groups desiring to participate in the international discussion prior to the Congress must give a written undertaking to recognize the authority of the Congress and pledge themselves in advance to accept the Congress's decisions on both political and organizational questions. On that condition, they may participate in the international pre-Congress discussion and may have fraternal questions at the Congress without voting rights, end quote. The Workers' Party, after meetings of Shachtman and C.L.R. James, the leader of the Workers' Party faction strongly favoring unity with the Workers' Party, finally agreed at a plenum of its National Committee to accept these conditions. As a consequence, Cannon informed the members of his National Committee that, quote, the majority opinion, end quote, in the political committee, quote, is definitely crystallizing in favor of going through with the proposition as outlined above, end quote. And added that, quote, I personally am convinced that taking everything into account nationally and internationally is a correct and necessary step, ... end quote. The February 1947 plenum of the Socialist Workers' Party agreed to the proposal for the Shachtmanites to participate in the preparations for the World Congress of the Fourth International. It went further and said that, quote, if the National Committee of the Workers' Party wishes to expedite matters and effect the unification even before the holding of the extraordinary convention, the National Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party will be agreeable to the proposition, ... end quote. To this end, quote, the National Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party will recommend that all members of the Workers' Party as of February 10, 1947, be admitted into the ranks of the Socialist Workers' Party as a body without prejudice or discrimination, and that this proviso be extended to include any new members who may be recruited by the Workers' Party in the meantime, provided they have not been previously members of the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. The next step was a joint statement by James Cannon and Max Shachtman dating March 11, 1947, on the unification of the two parties. It recounted the agreement of the Workers' Party to accept the results of the coming Congress of the International, referred to as the, quote, Extraordinary Party Convention, end quote, or EPC. Quote, even if the EPC should adopt decisions which would place the members of the Workers' Party in the position of a minority, end quote. It also noted the acceptance of the proposals by the plenum of the Socialist Workers' Party and said that unity of the two parties would be based on the memberships at the time the unification took place, and added, quote, however, while the unity negotiations are in progress, neither party will admit into its ranks any individuals or groups who are now or who have formerly been members of the other party except by agreement, end quote. On this basis, quote, the two national committees are recommending the unification of the two parties, ... as soon as the discussion now proceeding in the ranks of the two organizations is concluded, end quote. Unity never took place between the Socialist Workers' Party and the Workers' Party. A new series of controversies developed over Cannon's having described the position of Shachtmanites as one of, quote, capitulation, end quote, to the Socialist Workers' Party and the Fourth International over the Workers' Party's publication in Labor Action and New International of articles by ex-Socialist Workers' Party members Jack Weber and by Ruth Fisher, which the Canaanites regarded as provocative. Ruth Fisher was a member of the German Communist Party. I don't really know much about her biography. I think she became like a anti-communist. I don't know. I don't know what her trajectory was. Anyway, over failure to cooperate in certain local election campaigns and union situations in several parts of the country, and the Workers' Party challenged to the basis of representation at the coming World Congress, which had been decided upon by the International Secretariat of the Fourth International. The upshot was a proposal of a meeting of the Political Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party on May 6, 1947, to reverse the decision to unite with the Workers' Party. As Cannon explained the situation a month later to the New York membership of his party, quote, "It is equally obvious that any further consideration of the unity question with the Shachtmanites must await the terms of the Congress. The terms of our plenum resolution do not, in our opinion, at present require any alteration. The plenum says that the obligation they undertook to submit to the Congress must be carried out in good faith, and that can only be tested by the Congress itself." End quote. That was about the last that was heard of the possibility of merging the Shachtmanites back into the Socialist Workers' Party. However, the small pro-Socialist Workers' Party faction within the Workers' Party, led by CLR James, held its own national committee in July 1947 and there decided to join the Socialist Workers' Party. Other small parties. During the years following the establishment of the Socialist Workers' Party, there existed several small dissident Trotskyist groups in addition to the Shachtmanite and Ullrite organizations. These were centered principally in New York and San Francisco. In New York, there existed in 1939 to 40 the Revolutionary Marxist League, led by Antilio Salam and Karl Yerger. There also existed the Marxist Workers' League, led by K. Mienev, which published in 1939 a periodical named The Spark, and in 1940 another known as Power. For a short time, while the Revolutionary Marxist League and the Marxist Workers' League merged to form the Workers' Party, it apparently had gone out of existence before the formation of the Shachtmanite group with that same name. In California, centering in San Francisco, there existed in the 1937 to 1940 period the Marxist Workers' Party. It maintained for some years a Marxian labor college in San Francisco. Thanks for listening.